Thank you so much for joining me today at the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership. As we know, each year there's more than 400 humanitarian events around the world affecting tens of millions of people. There's a huge humanitarian demand for response. The international community do respond generously at times, but there is that gap between the humanitarian need and the humanitarian response. We all come from universities, and I'm wondering how universities and the humanitarian sector interact, and particularly what the value is of academic research in the humanitarian sector, particularly when there is that gap. Aid is scarce, need is quite significant. How do we justify the expenditure of that humanitarian response and aid on academic research? Rai, from your experience in the Pacific, what value is there, do you see, in academic research in the humanitarian sector?
Thank you, Professor. For me, I would start by giving you an example that we did on the localization research we did last year. From FNU, from the Fiji National University perspective, I would say that it really opened our eyes in looking at the context of how those resources and how those aid were supposed to be localized. And based on the findings that we were, on the research findings that we found, that we had, there's so many gaps that are there that needs to be filled. It started with policies. Some are complaining about the policies. How are they going to contextualize the policies? And then it went down to funding. How well those funds from donors, from big aids, and from big funders are being utilized for actual humanitarian responses. I would say from us, from an experience of the last disaster, Cyclone Winston, the report is still not been exposed to for public consumption. So we don't know how much was used for that cyclone or how much was donated from international donors. So it really leaves that gap for us, even for academics. How can we critic? How do we critic an audit report, or how do we critic something that we have not seen? We might be assuming, yes, we can assume, but based on what assumption or based on what report? And again, for localization, I would say it closes the gap. It closes the gap on combining or getting civil societies together, NGOs that are there in Fiji, to talk about the experiences and talk about how their resources or how their own resources were being utilized in the last disaster.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Aldrin, coming from the Philippines,
yes,
could you argue that academic research is a useful expenditure of humanitarian funds, or would you accept that it perhaps at times could be a waste, given the humanitarian need that's so immense at times?
it is. I think it is very important to actually incorporate academic research in terms of responding in humanitarian needs. And I'd like to build upon what Rai said earlier. I do agree about the needs to actually craft appropriate policies, and also to have public sort of accountability and transparency in terms of spending funds that are being poured in humanitarian responses. But aside from that one, I think there are also things that academic research, or not only academic research, but like academic people need to respond immediately after a humanitarian disaster, for example. And I think because there are specialized skills that only academicians could aptly provide. I could cite an example for psychosocial support, for example. We need psychologists who could provide such support immediately after a disaster. Another example of a dire need that could be responded by the people from the academe is trying to understand exactly how to deal with communities, especially those that have different culture. So I think it's important for us because one of the problems of the responders after a humanitarian disaster is normally they would have difficulties in terms of dealing with communities that hold a different worldview, that have a different culture. So I think it's very important if we have specialists who could somehow provide a bridge between the specialist and the responders, the technical people, and the community that needs help. Because sometimes there are communities wherein the responders could not just come in. They must be able to understand the dynamics of those communities. And I think these are things that academics could provide, and also that academic research could fill in terms of humanitarian needs.
So Teresa, is it a similar situation? You're coming out of the United States, a very wealthy donor country, enormous resources. Is there a particular level of responsibility that you have in your institution around the expenditure of humanitarian resources on academic research? Do you have the same level of responsibility that a university perhaps in a country affected directly by a humanitarian event have?
It's a good question. So I would share that from the perspective of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, which is an academic research center with a mission to advance the science and practice of humanitarian response worldwide through research and education, our focus is primarily on applied research. So research that directly addresses challenges that humanitarian practitioners and policymakers are facing. I would share that the primary purpose of this applied research is to better understand what works and what doesn't work in humanitarian response in order to more effectively serve those populations who've been affected by disaster and crisis. To your question about the justification of funding for academic research as opposed to direct operational delivery, this is a dilemma. This is a gap that we see. And I would argue, and we argue at HHI, that given the fact that there are billions of dollars spent on humanitarian aid, it is imperative that we understand better what really works and what doesn't in humanitarian response, and also to be able to assess and direct those precious resources toward interventions that have been proven effective in the field. So I do think we have a really serious responsibility in order to help the field evolve and improve our knowledge base, build the evidence base, and really the primary purpose is to more effectively enable humanitarian responders and policymakers to serve those in need.
Thank you. Phil, when you're dealing with donors, either private foundations or government donors, are they receptive to academic research being part of a humanitarian response?
Yes, we've always found them to be very receptive to it because, and working in partnership with the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership, we're also, as a Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, it's about working in partnership with practitioner organisations, learning from them, working with them. And what we have found from donors, particularly, say, the IKEA Foundation, is that they want that link between the practitioner and the academic. There's been a siloed understanding where you've had practitioners and you've had academics, and those two haven't necessarily spoken the same language. And quite often academics have been seen to be the ivory tower, those that want to go out and critique everything, and that everything is wrong, and that so it hasn't been an engagement with practitioners at that level of how do you improve policy, how do you improve practice, how do you inform academic understandings of what is happening, especially in a chaotic situation that is constantly changing as a frontline humanitarian responder. The complexity of humanitarian responses these days is engaging people in different ways at different times. There is no such thing as a simple response these days. So, and I would say that there needs to be that link between an almost external observer that is a colleague and a friend, but is also able to provide a perspective that is not based in the day-to-day. We often talk about with practitioners about being able to take that step back onto a balcony view, to take a broader view of the day-to-day workings, so that you do think about Why are we doing this? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What are the implications of it? And those are the sorts of areas where I think academics working with practitioners and with a good understanding of what's going on can assist in better understanding both for policy and for practice.
So I'd be interested then in hearing some examples where academic research has actually either affected professional practice or has provided some evidence base for how things might change in the future responses. So Aldrin, from the University of the Philippines, can you think of one or two examples where research around a humanitarian event has actually changed our understanding of that event or perhaps changed the practices in future responses?
Okay, so one example that I could give to you, because I'm from the Department of Linguistics, would be really on trying to understand how indigenous knowledge systems of local communities actually help them respond better to disaster events. And this happened during the Yolanda, typhoon Yolanda, when we realized that the weather forecasters were using a term that people did not understand. And so we did some research, and we found out that there are terms that are available in local languages that could have been used and could have been understood by people. And that particular word is metaphorically derived, but is quite common in a number of languages in the Philippines. So we believe that if such research had been done prior to that and such a term had been used, then probably thousands of lives could have been saved.
Are you expecting now for that more local term to be used at the official level as a result of that research?
I believe so. And I think it's in line with the localization efforts in Fiji, for example. It's very important for us to understand, because these people, they have ways of trying to understand natural events or disasters in the language, and normally they use metaphor to be able to tell us exactly how do they understand these things. And when we don't use the terms that they use, then they would not also be able to respond appropriately. Because if they know how to respond, if they exactly understand what the event is all about, what the disaster is all about. So what happened during the Yolanda scenario was that people did not understand what storm surge was. So people did not really prepare. They did not even think about going to higher places because we did not have that vocabulary before. So I think it's very important to actually understand the worldview of these people based on their local languages, and also to try to understand how they see the world and how they see events that are beyond their control.
Thank you.
Could I just, it's a really interesting point, and especially around climate change, increased intensity, storms that have never been experienced before, Yolanda being one, the most powerful storm that's hit, land. Do you think language and local language is going to change over time depending on the strength? Because that notion, even an understanding in the local language of what a storm surge might be, if you haven't experienced the intensity of a storm like that previously, that whole notion about what you have done in the past may not be enough. So is there going to be a change at the local level around the use of language and how, and I'm coming at it from the work we did around localization within the Pacific, and just trying to get an understanding of the importance of that and the way local communities will respond given the increasing intensity of those sorts of systems.
Well, I see your point. I think there is going to be some sort of evolution in terms of that particular concept, but I think the underpinning sort of framework for the creation of such concept would remain the same. So probably would be adding some sort of intensifiers before the main word, but I think the fact that that word operates not only in terms of the movement of seawater, for example, but it also operates in some other domains of language use, then I think the intensification will be added, but the core concept will be there. So I'm not sure if people would be able to create a new term for this one. But the thing is, once people create this term, they basically have a mental representation of that particular event. And having a mental representation is important for them to be able to craft appropriate response in such incidents, natural disasters.
Right, from the Fiji National University, any examples where your research has helped understand humanitarian responses or changed responses from the past?
I think apart from the localization research that we have done, the amount of, the level of awareness that has been going on has intensified more lately. I would just say an example from an episode post Winston, when they were broadcasting this cyclone, tropical cyclone Winston. They didn't even know the extent of the cyclone. They were saying, okay, they're giving warnings. It's a TC5, it's a level 5 cyclone. And everybody was saying, maybe we'll just wait for level 6 or level 7. That kind of stereo. And I was going, oh my goodness, sorry, I'm going to say this, but that level of awareness that had changed, that had made them realize that the level of cyclone just, it reached 5. It's not more than 6 or 7. We're not expecting any tornado in the South Pacific, and over the post after the cyclone Winston, they are broadcasting all these awareness programs on the levels of cyclone and the flooding and everything on the radio. I'm glad that has come to light. And the other example that I would say as well, coming back to the language, I'm glad that we still have the three main languages in Fiji. The awareness comes in Hindi, English, and the vernacular, the Fijian, the Itoke language. So even if there's an awareness program or newspapers or broadcast on the radio, it comes in 3 languages. So none of us will be lost on the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add one more example? After all these disasters that had happened in the previous decade, a very important project was launched in the university. It's called Project NOAA. And it's basically spearheaded by people from the National Institute of Geological Sciences in the University of the Philippines. And it's basically trying to identify high-risk zones in terms of flooding. And they were able to get to the point of creating like an application that people can download and check from time to time to see which areas are having floods. So I think, and this is a contribution, an important contribution of the academe. And it's not just one person that's doing this. This is a collaboration. So I'd like to segue to the importance of collaboration in humanitarian response. I think one very important sort of development that humanitarian endeavor has contributed to the academe is, trying to put premium into collaborative work. So I think humanitarian response is something that does not only need collaboration, but I think it requires collaboration. In the same way that, for example, for the longest time, social sciences have been heavily ignored in terms of humanitarian response, but nowadays you need to have your geographers, your psychologists, and your anthropologists and your sociologists collaborate together to be able to give appropriate response to a humanitarian need.
And then, of course, we move from disciplinary collaboration to partnerships. So, Teresa, I wonder if you could share a little bit about the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative household survey that's just been completed in the Philippines, and some of the information that will reveal that may actually affect responses down the track to disasters.
Sure, I'd be happy to share a little bit about that briefly, but building on the point that was raised about collaborations, I wanted to share with you an example of an innovation and how research is conducted and how that has really transformed how research is conducted and data is collected in humanitarian settings. Two of our faculty members recognize the need for practitioners on the ground and researchers in academia to have more accurate, better coordinated, and easier access to data in humanitarian settings. And they founded what's called the COBO Toolbox. And this is a free, open software platform that works to really strengthen data collection and management, to coordinate assessments, and to support evidence-based decision-making in humanitarian settings. And this software is easy to use. It's available online, it's available offline. It has been adopted by over 1,000 organizations, a number of UN agencies and NGOs all around the world. And they've had something like 2 million data surveys that have been conducted on this platform. And that allows the users to share the data in real time. It allows responders to track information and share it with their agencies as with others in terms of getting the appropriate level of supplies, of population counts, of all sorts of needs communicated immediately. And it also allows researchers to design surveys and ask questions for those folks in the field. So this is really an example of an innovation that has been really exciting in the field to see that level of impact.
Probably required university to take a lead on that. That probably would not be something that an NGO or a donor would probably be able to do.
And I should share that the founders of the COBO Toolbox are Fong Pham and Patrick Vink, and they worked together in collaboration with humanitarian practitioners on the ground and technologists to develop this software. So it's a really exciting innovation in the field.
Thank you. So I now wonder whether we might just turn our attention to the humanitarian risks and perceptions of risks. Again, if we're looking at the Pacific or looking at Asia, what would be the most obvious risks that you're concerned about at the moment in terms of humanitarian risks facing the Pacific? Perhaps first, Rai, and then we'll look at Asia, and then we'll come back and look at North America and Australia.
I think looking at the Pacific, accountability will top the list. Who is accountable for the consumption of or the utilization of resources being pumped into humanitarian responses? Good example that I have mentioned before, the audit report for the Cyclone Winston in Fiji. We're still waiting to see that report, but it goes back to the risk of looking at, how much expenditure was being utilized, who are the beneficiaries of the donors or the fund that were given, and how much resources. And the other risk that I would add into it was the oversupply of resources, and the underutilization of that supply. At some point, I would say that only specific people would benefit. The ones that are not receiving or supposed to be receiving, who live remotely in most affected areas, are just waiting to receive what they need. And in terms of accessibility is one of the top risks as well. Accessibility to many things, to needs, to resources, to assistance, and humanitarian responses.
So planning for those risks is how could, for example, the Fiji National University assist with the planning to address those risks or to mitigate those risks?
It's part of collaboration. The National University is part of this network of humanitarian actors. Either they are partners with, from my school, I would say the School of Public Health. It comes under the Ministry of Health. But other colleges in the National University, they would pair up with the Ministry of Local Government, the Rural Development, which they have their own disaster team, who directly responds to the main National Disaster Management Office, and that's the only national office that coordinates and plans the activities for other platforms or other organizations that are part of the humanitarian action groups.
Okay, thank you. Eldrin, out of the Asia region,
Yeah.
what do you see as on the horizon as being significant risks for that part of the world that is home to the bulk of the world's population?
Exactly. I'd like to echo Rai's response earlier. I think the risk that I'm really quite afraid would happen in the country would be when a natural disaster would be somehow happening alongside a human cost sort of humanitarian disaster. So if you have heard that our national government waged war against the extremist group in Mindanao, and so the Marawi war happened, there were many people who were displaced after the war that actually need a humanitarian response. But we could not act as swift as possible because we're still recuperating from the previous natural disasters that happened in the country. And there's so much sort of impediment to actually delivering what people need because of so many problems. Some of them Rai mentioned earlier. One is sort of accessibility, the bureaucratic layers preventing people access to support that they need, and of course the approach of the government towards states and organizations that are willing to provide aid. I think it's quite important to also consider that point. But yes, I am anticipating higher risk in the case of the Philippines. We are still preparing for a major natural disaster, which is a huge earthquake. So a lot of research are being done to actually identify areas that are quite prone to such a disaster. But it's never going to be like we'll never feel the real thing unless we experience it. I hope not. But yes, that's one thing that we are currently doing research on.
So North America, United States and Australia experience their own humanitarian events, wildfires, hurricanes, droughts and things like that. I'm just wondering, perhaps I'll start with you, Phil, does the experience of a humanitarian event in a country like Australia change the way that we understand humanitarian, the requirements of humanitarian assistance in other countries, or do we mentally see them as two very distinct activities that don't relate to each other as a donor and then as a responder?
They're not even called humanitarian events. They're called emergency management events, and more countries around the world are doing that, not just wealthy countries. And I know there's, I would say, understand in the United States, they're not because they're dealt with locally, and that whole notion about humanitarian is about external involvement, or that's been the history of it. So they're dealt with, and wealthy countries like Australia, you have your well-developed fire services, you have your well-developed, emergency management staff that just kick into place and do that. Federally on state-located emergency services that then just kick in when especially when a natural disaster happens, or we haven't had conflict, but certainly if something happens, then it is police or federal police or state police that would kick in those sort of circumstances. It's not about that notion about an external response to a humanitarian side. Does it influence our understandings of humanitarians? Yes and no, because it can provide some understandings about how governance systems and how those sorts of systems can be implemented. And so it can inform in that sense how it is actually done a little bit, but the practice it's normally what you learn internationally that you would bring back for a lot of practitioners. And because it is so specialised, the services are so specialised in wealthy countries that there isn't that notion of a generalist practice that there might be within the humanitarian context. The notion that Eldrin was talking about human-induced disaster, conflict, those sorts of things, overlaid by natural disaster is becoming way more common, especially where conflict is ongoing. The whole notion about extended periods of humanitarian intervention, where you're ending up with, say, 15 years, is that humanitarian intervention if it is continuing over the length of time? The whole notion about that humanitarian development nexus, where does that sit within all of this? All of these things are starting to become more important with the complexity of what is happening globally, overlaid by the politics that are then informing that. You know, a shift to nationalism, a shift to more inwardly focused governments, the implications of that for a globalised understanding. So there are a whole range of factors that are coming together to make it far more complex and challenging in areas where humanitarian responses are happening.
So then if we go to the United States, where you'll have experience of the same event affecting neighbouring countries as well as mainland United States in an environment of rising populism. So it'd be interested reflecting on what Phil was just talking about, how what the local response is to an international disaster when it's actually the same event that has also caused significant damage and loss of life in the United States as well. How is it possible for a country to respond internationally and at the same time locally and do so in an equitable way?
It's a really good question, and I would certainly echo everything that Phil has shared in terms of the current landscape and the rise of populism and the turn toward an inward-facing, inward-looking approach from organizations. There is one thing I wanted to quickly draw into this conversation from your earlier question, from the point that Aldrin raised about disaster preparedness and response in the Philippines, in particular related to some of the recent typhoons. I did want to be able to address your question about the survey that we had done. This is part of our program called Disaster Net Philippines, which really seeks to understand and address how communities mitigate the impact of disaster. And this survey was really the first of its kind. It was a nationwide survey at the household level to better understand how households are prepared to respond to these types of disasters, particularly when they happen repeatedly. And this really helped create a baseline survey to understand how communities, how local and national governments can better prepare and empower local communities to be prepared and resilient for when these disasters continue. Back to your point about the rise of populism and what that means for the politics of humanitarianism, I would share that the rise of populism, which can be viewed as one response to the increase in global terrorism and global migration over the past several years, has resulted in a corresponding cultural and nationalist backlash. And we have seen a rise in conservative ideologies. We've seen a greater shift of individual countries wanting to increase protection of their borders, this shift toward being inward-looking, inward-focused, and also toward, when making policy, really taking a national stance as opposed to being part of an international community. We see this in the US, for example, with its direct negotiations with North Korea as opposed to going through the UN. We see it in the US pulling out of the Paris climate agreements. And we've also heard discussions within the last few days about the United States potentially pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council. So what this means, I think, for the politics of humanitarianism is that it's going to be really challenging. We're seeing some real concerns about the respect for international humanitarian law. And this is going to be a real challenge going forward.
So the Philippines has its own populist president. Have you seen or been able to observe changes to domestic responses to humanitarian events, given what you were talking about before, and with the overlay of the human crisis as well as the natural events?
Well, of course, our President Duterte has explicitly stated a number of refusals to foreign aid, for example. And I think this is quite dangerous because, again, I think humanitarian work in general should be a sort of an international kind of agreement among people. I think we are bound by that sort of responsibility to actually respond to the needs that would arise in the conditions of other countries or other states. But the rise of populism in the country, again, just adding on what Theresa said earlier, I think somehow made people more selfish, if I could say the word, in the sense that we are trying to be more concerned about what would benefit us, at the same time ignoring the needs of other people. And I think this should cause alarm to not only organizations, states, and probably other stakeholders that are involved in humanitarian work. Because I think one important core value that underlies humanitarian work, humanitarian response, and the whole domain of it is really that value of empathy and of really trying to feel for other human beings. And I think populism is becoming antagonistic to this particular undertaking, and I think it's quite dangerous.
And that brings us,
we're feeling it in the Philippines.
so that brings us to leadership and the question of leadership and humanitarian leadership. Phil, I wonder whether you could just talk a little bit about some of the research that's gone on in the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership around the value of good leadership within a response, and then perhaps Ryan, you might sort of also reflect on that in the Pacific, particularly after perhaps Cyclone Winston.
It's the research that we've undertaken has indicated that, well, and there's been a lot of research, ALNAP research, ODI research over the last decade looking at the notion of leadership within the humanitarian space, and that has kicked off all sorts of initiatives, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, CHL, all of those sorts of things, trying to ascertain and understand leadership and improve the leadership capacity across the board. And I think what we need to recognise is that leadership within the humanitarian space, is not about that heroic leader out the front holding the flag. It is about leadership within teams. It is about working with people. It is about recognising culture. It's about recognising local entities. There's a whole range of issues in there, and that leadership is built around the person and around how they behave. For us at CHL, we work around that notion of leadership behaviours, and that anybody can demonstrate leadership behaviours at any point in any context. And it is about recognising those behaviours and getting people to know themselves well enough to be able to understand their form of leadership, because it's not about teaching to a leadership theory and that sort of stuff. It is about enabling people to understand themselves to be as good a leader as they can possibly be in their context. And so for us, it's about developing local leaders and developing international leaders. It's about leadership across the board. And I'm just starting to look at some research around that notion of branding and leadership, and how people within organisations become so enamoured with the brand of the organisation that they forget that leadership is about cooperation both across organisations but also within organisations. And so hopefully this might start to shed some light on how we might then work at leadership. And the humanitarian sector is full of branding. Because it is about gathering as many resources to your organisation to deal with the people that you were trying to deal with, those needs assessments that you've done, and we've got to get as many resources to out what we're doing and get our brand out there as much as possible. That comes from donors, that comes from organisations, and so it's about scrabbling out there and grabbing all of those resources to channel them through you. Whether that's the best way of doing it within a humanitarian response is the question. And time again, it's been seen that it's not the best way to do it. It is about working collaboratively who's best placed to deal with different situations as they arise, whether that be a local organisation with, on their own, whether that be a local organisation with support, whether that be an international organisation that might be invited in to provide a specific piece of expertise. All of those sorts of things need to be taken into account in leadership, and we need to be mindful of, as leaders, what that means for both for our organisation, but most importantly for affected populations.
So affected populations in Fiji after Cyclone Winston, or during and leading up to perhaps, what sort of leadership was occurring that you were able to observe?
I would really agree with what Phil has mentioned. In Fiji, it was obvious that they were community leaders. They were existing leaders at village level, divisional level, provincial level. And we have this controlling a leader of the NDM, the National Disaster Management Office, who controls everything from human resources to capital to funding to whatever is being allocated to affected population, even to transportation. Everything was controlled at state level. So with these humanitarian programs and activities or even responses, what we want to see is how do we strengthen those community leaders. We are not reinventing new leaders within the structure, but those that are there, whether they are appointed as civil servants to become leaders at provincial level, or those that are culturally or generally, well, they were culturally meant to be leaders, so reinstated leaders. We've got some of those back home. We want them to be aware of what is happening or what is needed to be done, even before and after or post-disaster. Training them, making them to go through training programs or refresher training programs at community level. And who would be the good people, or who would be the good organization or appropriate organization to take that training right down to community level or village level? We have program trainers, even at NGO level. They are trainers at NGO level. They are trainers at university level who can take the training program right down to that level. And well, it'll make it easier for coordination from state level to subnational to community level if we have, well-trained community leaders at the lower level. So it would be easier for coordination, for planning, either go vertically or from national, state level to community level. Both ways it make it easier and convenient as well.
Thank you. So, yes, Elgin.
Can I just add to that? I do agree with Rai that it's important to actually be able to train local leaders. But again, I think it's also important to focus less on individual leaders and more on strengthening institutions. I think when we say humanitarian leadership, this should not just be about an individual leader, but rather could be an institutional leader that could survive even if you replace the individual that actually leads the country or leads the local community. So I think in the Philippines, what we need right now is really to have strong institutions that could respond to humanitarian needs, whoever the president is. Because we have been too focused about the leaders. In fact, one reason why the previous administration lost is because of the kind of response that they had during the Typhoon Yolanda. So I think that's one point that I'd like to make. I think it's important for us to really focus more on institutions and build the concept of leadership around institutions, centers, hubs that will survive whoever the leader is. Another one, I think it's very important for us to start to educate people at a young age. So in the University of the Philippines right now, we have a new general education course, which is only about disaster risk and mitigation and prevention system. So it's a general education course that could be taken by university students. And in that course, the students will learn how to respond, mitigate, and what systems could be done to actually prevent disasters? Because like what Teresa said earlier, one big problem in the Philippines is just disasters and humanitarian needs just keep on repeating. And somehow we're not learning from them. Tacloban, which is hit by Yolanda, for example, I think is becoming the same old Tacloban before Yolanda happened. So I think it's very important to really educate people at a young age, and I believe in the future there's also a need to actually include in the curriculum of basic education students or pupils concepts, important lessons about disaster and humanitarian work in general.
And if I may add as well, building upon the points that Phil and Aldrin raised, I'd like to share that far too few resources have been spent on leadership in the humanitarian sector. When compared to the private sector or to the military, there's very little training for leadership within the humanitarian space. And humanitarian settings are arguably among the most complicated and complex that we will see anywhere in the world. I would also share that it is very challenging to measure the effectiveness of leadership training programs, and would argue that universities are uniquely positioned to be able to utilize different methods and approaches for how to measure and ascertain the effectiveness of various leadership programs. Just before I came to Melbourne, I was actually in the Philippines, and we spent a week with the National NGO Program on Humanitarian Leadership, which is a program that the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative works together with the International Medical Corps and Concern Worldwide to train emerging leaders in various regions around the world on exactly these types of issues, on leadership issues that are leadership challenges that are adaptive in nature as opposed to technical, leadership challenges that require compromise, independent decision making and assessment and collaboration. And we are in the early stages of understanding how we can empower and provide agency for people at all levels within humanitarian response to take on these challenges. So I want to share that it's a really important issue within the field. We need more of it. I'm really excited to be here and be talking with you all at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership about this work and learn more about what you're doing and be able to help expand this work in various settings around the world.
So I began the discussion today asking whether universities had a role to play in the humanitarian sector in terms of expenditure of those scarce resources. And my sense is, following this conversation, that quite clearly universities are part of the humanitarian sector. They're not a part of it, they actually are part of it and incorporated into it, and they do provide an enormous amount of resource in and of themselves to understand responses, to understand leadership, to understand the importance of long-term institutional capacity. So I'd like to thank you all very much for spending some time with me today and for sharing your views. So from the University of the Philippines, Harvard University, Fiji National University, and the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership hosted here at Deakin University. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.